Mike, for today's meeting,
Yep.
Since it's not being recorded,
It actually is.
oh, okay, good. Then you don't have to take the same notes, but any questions that we have on the Board of Selectmen or on the, contract, I told I would put forward to Kate.
Yeah.
So, anything would be greatly appreciated. Okay, it's sometime, whatever it is, I'm calling them,
7:32.
thank you. I'm calling the meeting to order. First on the agenda is the town employee contract. Spoke to Kate several times today. Kate wanted to provide some additional information, and that is the way they work the budget, or at least how Kate works the budget, is during the time from the last budget, they start putting notes down on anything that might be required for the budget, things that the employees might want, things that the department heads might want, things that come up. So it's not that they show up and they go, oh, it's budget year, what should we do now? And while they were negotiating, there were a couple of sticking points on this contract, and so the town walked away from the table. They came back to the union, suggested that before it goes to arbitration, that maybe they bring in a mediator. A mediator was brought in, and that ended up with the contract that we're currently seeing. For those who were here for the last contract, or the last round of union contracts, we capped the amount of pension that anyone could earn, with the exception of those that had already exceeded that. They continued to get another 5%. But in doing so, there was a agreement that we would not move new employees to a defined contribution plan during this round of contract negotiations. The last one was for 4 years. Kate didn't negotiate that, and we tried to figure out why it was 4 years and not 3, which is typical. Sometimes we do it, if we think that rates, and Kate did explain that if we think that the rates are going to be going up, or salaries will be going up greatly, we'll try for a 4-year contract. In this particular case, because we want to move forward on getting to a defined contribution for new employees, it's a 3-year contract. So that's all I have on it, other than now opening it up to the floor.
Well, I read the contract, and I didn't see anything that sticks out. And in general, what are we supposed to do? It's not Theresa May getting turned down by the British Parliament. We said, Kate Bush go back and renegotiate with the union. In this case, not the European Union, but public sector employee unions. So it's hard for us to say, we can't accept it this way. I think we have to trust her that the town has negotiated the best they could in this instance. And if Jack is right, and they almost went to arbitration, which is normally not a great idea, because they're going to rule in favor of the unions. I think that they pushed it as far as they could. Having said that, I spoke to Michael and he has some observations.
Can I just want to add one thing, because I'm glad you mentioned what you did. At this stage, the only thing we can do is, we're either going to accept this, we're voting not to reject the contract, not that we're accepting it. If we do, it's a nuance, but if we do reject it, then it goes immediately into arbitration. And unlike a mediator where they can find a middle ground, the way arbitration on union contracts works in the state of Connecticut is the union gives their side, the town gives their side, and the arbitrator goes A, B, B, C, C. So there's no middle ground in these things. It's either the union side or the town side that the arbitrator will be deciding. And as Bert did say, towns like Darien typically do not do well in arbitration. Simply because they think we can pay for things.
Well, I think, I had a couple questions. I know they were circulated to the committee. And thanks, Jack, for sharing that. And then I think Kate's responses. I think the first question was just more background, was just who comprised the negotiation team. And I have Kate's response on that. All makes sense. I guess one question I have, when you mentioned experience from the last time around, from about 3 or 4 years ago, is just that does the town typically engage outside counsel as a backstop to assist Kate in this case?
Yes, we have a union, we have a labor council. So like, while Wayne might do legal work,
Sure.
and actually a member of Wayne's firm helps with P&Z, John L'Souza, I believe his name is. They go to a labor council for all union contracts.
I figured as much, but I just wanted to pin that down. And then the other question I had was just that one statement that kind of popped out to me, and I saw Kate's response, but that my question was unfettered by any background or facts at that time. And I had the answer that, there was a statement that the town was anticipating some savings with this move to the DC plan. But then when I read that in our facts, it was elective, not a, in effect, forced move. It was just questionable to me as to what employee would elect to go from a defined benefit to a defined contribution plan. But I think Kate's response basically responded to that, put it in context for me, so.
And interesting enough, because when I read that also in the summary, it's like a 547 or something like that. And I said, is this new? And apparently it's been around for quite some time. So some people do choose, instead of getting a defined benefit, to have the money go to them. I think it's because it's a little bit more transportable. So, if you're not gonna be here for 30 years, and you're doing your 5-year, 6-year thing, that money can go with you, where the other one sits there, and when you turn 59 and a half, if you wanna take a discount, or 65, you might actually remember that you have it.
Yeah.
Also, that money can be passed on to your heirs,
Yeah.
whereas defined, a pension ends when you
Yeah,
die.
that's a very good point.
So that, her response answered my question, so, and I have no other questions really relative to the contract.
Are there any other comments, questions? Dave, I know you.
I unfortunately got called away this afternoon, by, college children problems. But if I understand it correctly, in future negotiations, they'll still attempt to set it up so that new employees will go to the defined contribution plan.
I mean, back in for those of us who were working in the way things are, defined benefit were converted to a defined contribution, depending upon where you were. Some of us still had a little mixture of two. But in other places, I know definitely with unions, what they did is the only way they could get it passed back in the nineties was anybody new comes in, gets one plan, the other people get the other, because unions weren't about to fight for somebody they don't even know. So, but this is like almost 30 years later.
Jackie, you mentioned that they capped out the amount that you could earn on the defined benefit plan?
Yes,
So when someone reaches their cap and then can they subsequently elect to be engaged in a defined contribution plan? So they have both?
actually, it's a good thing. It's been a very long day, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Part of the reason, one of the things with this elective with the defined contribution is if a retired police officer chooses to be one of the dispatchers, they would not be able to participate in the defined defined benefit plan.
Well, they're
And
already
so-
maxed out, right?
Well, even if they haven't maxed out, they're drawing, so they're retired. So, so this would be the alternative plan in which they would participate. I don't remember to write that down. I think that was, Tammy had that question, actually.
I mean, that's
She's
all
in it.
upside for a retired policeman who becomes a dispatcher,
Yes,
because he's got nothing to gain by becoming a employee on a defined benefit plan. He's already got that.
he's gotten it, right. So, and he's drawing down, and I'm sure he doesn't want to, suspend.
Stop
so he
drawing
can-
it down and
right,
start
yeah,
paying
yeah,
back.
Yeah. So, anything else on this? Are we ready to vote? Can I have somebody move the motion for it?
I move.
Okay, and Taylor was second. All those in favor? Since it's unanimous, I'm not gonna ask for anything else. Next. This is this action was put in place. It was discussed at the Board of Selectmen meeting Monday, I believe. This action is put in place for government employees who were working but not paid, and were having difficulty making the January tax payment. And therefore, what was being done was, there was a deferral of any interest on that tax payment. And once the employees are made whole, Peter, you can inform us if that's happened yet. I can call my daughter and see if her husband's been paid yet. You have been paid? Okay. So once they have been paid, it's a 60-day window in which you have to make that tax payment. And after such time, you go back onto the interest penalty that was occurred. So that's basically it. I'm gonna ask you if you, as a federal employee, wanna vote on this or
I will abstain from further discussion and voting.
Okay, thank you.
So this was just raised in the last few weeks?
It actually been raised earlier. The state was doing something, many of the states, communities, banks and other things had done this, and so this was just getting the final resolution put together and
It's hard to
taking
see
care
a
of it.
town like Darien move so quickly, but it's good to see it.
Well, Barry, the size is not daunting. Apparently, it's one employee. It's one person who has applied so far.
Right.
It could be
Oh,
others,
there must
and
be
we
others.
might have another
There
shutdown.
must be others.
But right now, it's only one person.
So what
So-
happens if we have another shutdown? Does
Good
it-
statement.
I
does this-
have to double
Does this
check. I
just kind
haven't.
of kick in a new,
Yes, I
like a
would
new
think-
I would
timeframe
think
and
that
60 days?
yeah, well,
It's a
we'll
policy
kick in
going
until
forward.
July. But, yeah, I would consider that if it becomes a seesaw event, it would kick in, and then probably there would be some additional deferrals as, the
Well,
trickle down.
This will be on the books, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it'll last,
No, but if they were
Indefinitely.
supposed to make a payment in January and they took this, which I'm fine with. And then they have 60 days to pay it.
Right. What,
So we're in that 60-day period. If there's another shutdown
they, for the January, they still gotta pay.
in the 60 days.
Yes.
This is only for January. Even if we go into a shutdown, they don't get paid again.
Right,
Because they wouldn't have been waiting on that money to pay the bill.
Okay.
right. They'll be waiting on other money to pay for groceries. I'm just gonna make a comment, and which is totally out of order, but you can slap me afterwards. A good friend of mine is a truck driver, and during the shutdown, he was talking about how he was out west, and the independent truckers were just stacked up because nothing was moving. So while the press kept on talking about how this was affecting government employees, the trickle down to other people was rather significant.
Oh, yeah.
He,
And federal contractors too, sure.
yeah, federal contractors, I mean, the big guys were getting paid, the other people weren't,
Yeah.
and he sometimes moves things down to military bases and that. And, you know, he's not making up that money, and it put a real dent in his business. So it just, you know, it wasn't just, it was not, it's never good when the government shuts down.
Well, I think the impact, like we talked about, to the GDP is probably the only thing that resonates with Trump. I think that's like he cares about the most, so we may not see
Well,
it as
yeah,
sharp.
the numbers were astronomical of what it really was, and it was underestimated, even the total work. So, I mean, probably out of order to say that, but just, you know, I felt bad for him because, you know, he was really shut down for like a month, looking for stuff and moving stuff at a loss. So, all right, so can I, is there any other discussion on that? I will find out about that for further clarification, but I think that this 60-day clock starts ticking. Is there any other discussion on this? Okay, seeing none, can I have somebody move the motion? Taylor, second. Iris, all in favor? And one abstention. Okay, the next is the acceptance of the gift for fireworks. And earlier today, I wrote to Kate and Jen saying, when I first heard this, it's a gift of about $27,000 to pay for the fireworks, and I thought it would be voting for like what I typically call puppies and kittens. You know, it's one of those simple things, okay, fine, this is a good feel, vote for it. But then I realized there's some accounting issues here. So I've been, Kate, Jen and I have been passing back some emails on the accounting for it. And then Kate and I had a conversation on something else, so we clarified it. In the past, David Genovese and the Chamber have been fundraising for the fireworks. Last year it was started to take over by Park and Rec, and now it's going to be done by Park and Rec in a public-private partnership. And so there's certain expenses associated with it, the cost of the fireworks, the cost of cleanup, tarps that we need to put on the field to protect them, and other things along those lines. Those are pretty much funded very generously from several businesses, and David Genovese has done a marvelous job, which we're very grateful for having this event occur. At the same time, there's basically the entire police force is here that night, from what I understand, and since it's a Saturday, it is not necessarily a cheap event, because this is part of that overtime that we were looking at. Those costs are not covered. So this is some additional funds for, oh, and plus, when we were collecting for the $25 for the 300 spots or the $7,500 for parking on the grounds, the town collected it, but then gave it to the chamber as part of the contribution to pay for the event. Now, going forward into fiscal year 2020, one of the things that Kate has done, which at least I personally am in favor of, is that instead of having all of these park and rec events that are sort of netting each other out, she's putting the expenses on the books, and the offset revenue is being added to revenue, so you can actually see it's a little more transparent that way where these things are coming, instead of it going into contra accounts. And unless we're looking at the chart of accounts, we have no knowledge of what's happening. This sort of fits into that. Partly because these are funds that the chamber had from prior year, but it's gifted in this fiscal year for an event that will occur in fiscal year 20. So they are investigating whether or not it's appropriate to set up one of the funds that we were just reviewing for the special events for Parks and Rec, because you have, I believe, the Weed Beach Festival and a couple of other things that are pretty large events. So they would be accounted for within this fund. Currently, it will be it's accounted for in a contra account. But since it's for fiscal year 20, it's really being posted as a liability and not taken into income. Any expenses that occur in this fiscal year, we make prepayments on certain things since it's 4 or 5 days into the new fiscal year, will be taken from these funds, but there will still be fundraising for that fireworks event that will be done probably starting in the March timeframe. So we're anticipating additional funds coming in. So that's the accounting of it. I expressed earlier today that for something like this, I am in favor of setting up a separate fund for the expenses and the revenue, so that they're more easily tracked. The police will continue to be an expense of the town and not be offset by any funds raised. And they're gonna stay in the police overtime.
So that's what they're gonna do, they're gonna set up a liability, and they receive the funds and set up a liability, and so there's no effect on income this year, and next year they're gonna just book it against the liability, so it's fine, right?
Yeah, accounting wise, it's fine. Obviously, they may draw down against the liability if you have to make an advance payment to the gentleman who's doing the fireworks or the company. That will be drawn down against these funds. So I just wanted, since we're F&B, I thought I would check on how we're doing the accounting on this, since it seemed to be lapping 2 fiscal years. So I'll try and articulate that a lot more clearer than I just did, so I don't totally confuse the RTM.
In my mind, what you described is kind of just conjuring up what I recall years ago was you receive money and you have to perform against it in a future period. It's like a prepaid subscription.
Yep.
You have a liability and you got to perform later on. That's all we're talking about here.
Exactly.
And that prepaid subscription concept is gonna work great for you for describing it to the general RTM.
Yeah. I'll put that
See,
down.
we have CPAs on board.
Well, I'm one also, I just didn't articulate
It's
it.
a simple concept that people will be able to get, right?
I'm teeing it up for you, Jack.
If you didn't realize that I was asking for any help that we could, that's fine, because I was playing with T accounts.
Oh, Lord.
So, is there any other discussion on this? Great. Can I have somebody move the motion? Have Bill? Can I have second? Peter? All those in favor? That's great, unanimous, and nobody had to abstain simply because they go there. All right. Why don't we do the superintendent's budget first? I know that David was at the budget meeting this morning,
Yes.
as was Stacy.
Yeah, I was just texting her to ask about something, maybe you can answer it.
So, do you wanna,
Oh, boy.
do you wanna lead what,
Well, I didn't memorize all of the changes, but,
you don't have to. I spoke to Tara
Yeah.
subsequently with some.
yeah, that's fine. The big thing is the administration has, made a handful of changes. They got the increase down to 2.82%, so that's the current administration number. The Board of Ed, has made other subsequent, proposals. Those proposals have yet to be voted on, so they are not hard or cast in, stone. The two big ones, to my mind, of all that list, is a bunch of like, small $5,000, $12,000, $15,000 ones. The two big ones, from that list are, there was one of the board members, the guy's name is escaping me. He had actually proposed cutting the number of psychologists that they were gonna hire from 4 to 2.
That's
So
Burke,
that-
Ryan Burke.
Yeah, and they allocated that across, the different schools, so half, psychologists for each of 4 different, schools. If I remember correctly, the salary for the psychologist is around $76,000, but then you add in other benefits and such, you're easily at $150 per each, minimum, I would say, per year. So that would be a net savings of about 300, if it
It's
gets.
double?
No, it would be about. 100.
Sorry, 76, but
And
by
then
the time
20.
per person, plus by the time you add in benefits, I'm guessing 150.
No, it'd be
Wow.
about
That's a lot of
20%. It's
benefits
20%, so
Be
it'd
close
be
to
about
like
100.
maybe.
Okay, so 100,
100%.
so 200, so that'd be $200,000. And Tara put forth to increase the excess cost reimbursement by $100,000. So those are the two big items. So, call it 300. The board is proposing roughly 300 in change to reduce the budget further. I'm not sure that the psychologist cuts will go through. My sort of read from having been going to the meetings is people are more in favor of that than not. So I would kind of suspect that won't happen. So the only real big one would be the excess cost side. And I think, Jack, you had some thoughts on that.
Looking at it, and there's two things, because I think one of the comments that was made at one time by Feeney has confused both board members and the public, and members of this committee as well. Right now, they got last year about 3.4, 3.5 mil, correct? In the excess cost
Yeah,
reimbursement.
yeah.
And with what they had, they had a significant amount of additional funds that they have. Now, I do recognize that depending upon they're not gonna find out what their real reimbursement rate is until March or so. And that's pretty well into the school year to all of a sudden start cutting things if you're not making the number that you had proposed. I mean, most of the stuff has already been spent. That being said, they've had 2 years in a row with some rather sizable differences between what was budgeted and what was received. I believe when I do the backup calculation at 72%, what the reimbursement was, we submitted over $5 million of expenses for reimbursement, not counting the deductible. So I thought that at the very least, $150,000 would have been a reasonable increase. It still would have given them sufficient funds based upon they seem to be tracking with the same number of submission this year as they did last year. The budget that they have this year, again, is, that they're putting forward is at a 70%, not the 72 that they've gotten. So again, that adds some $100,000 worth of flexibility to it. And it also provides a 12 basis point, about a 12 basis point reduction in their overall budget. And it's not affecting education. So it's one of the things that I personally thought could have been higher. The things that's confusing, and it's partly how this is calculated, right now, based upon people that are aging out of the program, our submissions will be down by $1 million not next fiscal year, but the following fiscal year will be down $1 million.
How many people are,
I can't tell you how many people are there. That they haven't told us. I know that Heather's doing the tracking, so she's trying to track everything, and she's finding the same thing that Feeney was doing, from what I understand. But if they lose $1 million worth of expense, all right, people worry that if they move it up to 2.9 this year, oh my goodness, next year when they lose that they would be under 2.9. But it's all based upon, number one, what you're submitting. Number two, if we have students that are aging out, then, because I'm just gonna guess how many it is, but our deductible is approximately $90,000 per student. So at $90,000 per student, if that was 3 students, that's another $300,000 of expense that we're not having, approximately. So special ed for this group of students, ultimately, you would expect the expense to also go down by $1.3 million. So the fact that they might have to lower excess costs is offset that expenses just went down. Now, that doesn't mean that a new group of students aren't coming in.
You can predict that, can you?
Well, they have pretty good understanding of predicting it,
Okay.
because some of it's coming in through ELP, some of it they've already spoken, they go on an annual basis to all of the other local nursery schools. So the one thing you can predict is somebody moving to town who has an IEP that you weren't anticipating. But providing that they don't have a same base of students coming in, I mean, you could end up with more students that have high needs but aren't at the 90,000 threshold. So you might not see the one-for-one offset. But the fact is that I would expect that the Board of Ed and Feeney and the Director of Special Ed would be able to explain that. So moving it up for next fiscal year has no relationship to what's gonna happen the subsequent one. And for the taxpayers, I thought $150,000 was an appropriate amount. The other thing that I think some of us talked about, with no disrespect to our interim superintendent, but I have a little difficulty in reducing the teaching role of the department chairs until the new superintendent comes in. I'd rather the new superintendent make that decision than an interim one. And that has about a $60,000 impact if that's added back in.
Where are
Did
these
you guys
department
start
chairs?
today?
I saw some of it, yeah.
What is the department head
Like the high
proposal? That's one of my
school, I
two
I
questions.
think
High
the
school,
department head
various-
That's what I
proposal
would
is that
think,
all
but
the department heads
Talking
would
our last
Oh,
meeting,
back
wait,
to
wait,
teaching.
no, but it's for the high school and the middle school, isn't it? These
Yes,
departments-
yes.
the department chairs. for
Yeah, here's
High
what,
school and the middle school?
yeah, here's what happened, with Dr. Brenner. In the past, the high school and the middle school had pairs who were the department heads.
Mhm.
And so I go to Iris and we're working together and I said, you know, Iris, you're not really teaching that well. And Iris looks at me and goes, yeah, Jack, jump in a lake. You know, and that's what was going on. And so some of the things from the administration on curriculum, the one-to-ones, and some of the things weren't being driven down. In addition, when there was a disconnect, especially I understand Weston Civ is the one that's killing everyone. There was a disconnect between what was being done in 8th grade and what's expected in 9th grade on the curriculum on some of these courses. And as I said, my kids haven't taken Western Civ in over 10 years. Probably longer. But the kids were really in like culture shock when they went into that class because there was a disconnect between 8th and 9th grade. So by hiring somebody who is more attuned to going in, working with the teachers and that, they were able, and is an administrator, has input into your annual review as a teacher, that sort of smoothed it out. In addition, there was a hidden aspect there. There were several teachers, from what I understand, allegedly, let's put that word in, that were not following what was going on. And this was a way to sort of make their life a little more difficult. So that the school system either had them starting to follow what the administration wanted in the curriculum, or they were going to leave. Either way, it was a win-win for the school. So there has been turnover, but there's also been a lot of teachers who have now conformed to what the administration's view of what a curriculum is supposed to be and how it's supposed to be taught. So those were the two aspects that was put in. In order to stay in touch, they were supposed to teach one course, 1 year in Middlesex, 1 year at the high school. It's, I think, been operational for 2 years now, right? This is second year.
Now, we're talking about one person
Yeah, one
responsible
person.
in both the high school and Middlesex?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a.
So it's a
It's not
continuity thing.
one in the high school and one in the.
Nope, and I think all of the people that were selected, maybe with the exception of one, all came from within. I think most of the people who took on that role were internal hires. So, I mean, from what I understand, anecdotally, people are happy with some of the results that are going on. It's very hard for me to know, again, my kids are long gone. So when they proposed cutting that teaching role, means they had to add back like 1.5 teachers, and I know that I'm just uncomfortable personally with that while we're with an interim superintendent. You know, I'm not saying that it works, doesn't work, or other things like that, but I'd rather that the new superintendent make that call, because once you take it off the table, putting it back on is always difficult.
So Jack, suppose we all agree with your assessment.
Right.
How do we communicate that? Because we're not really voting on the budget right now.
Right.
How do we communicate that back to the powers that be, that we say if it came, or we right now think leave the department chair the way they are operating, and let's wait for a new superintendent. He may not even like having department chairs. I never did, actually.
I know
last
you
year. But suppose the new guy says we don't like him, why change it now and then just reverse course? So how do we communicate that?
I think that we can either write something, I mean, we've already had somewhat of a say, but what I would do is call some of the board members individually and we can express thoughts to that. You know, people know people who are on the board. The CDSP already had a conversation. I don't wanna speak for them, but, you know, and because I was at the Board of Selectmen meeting and thought 2 meetings in one day was just too much for me, even though some people actually did it. I'm impressed. But I do think that they talked on that, if I'm not mistaken, the CDSP folks.
In
So,
favor or?
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know.
I don't remember that coming up, but I can look at the notes.
So there would be a motion now to, and we have to vote on it.
No, we don't have to, I'm just saying
Well,
if you,
we could have a motion where we communicate to the Board of Education our concern financially, because that's a privy we have, financially about reducing the time that the department chairs would be teaching from 20% to 0, right? That's a motion.
I have a slightly different approach.
Okay.
I don't think, while it does have financial impact, I don't think this is my analysis is a financial impact.
Well, then it's a education committee issue.
It is an observation of what's going on.
No, I would agree with you, but
And
the
I-
math is all we really.
But as members of the RTM, and the fact that we look at the budget, and it does have a minor financial impact, it's about 65 to 70,000. I wouldn't want to do a resolution because it's not our role to tell the Board of Ed how to do their business. But we can have a conversation saying, we are concerned about this, what are your thoughts?
Okay.
I don't like telling other boards
Okay.
So
how
we
to
tell
do
you
their
to
business.
talk to them?
What?
We just ask you to talk to them.
There's too many of them to talk to.
But isn't
Well-
this, I mean, this is,
They're gonna be voting on it, so
Yeah.
we
Isn't
can,
this is some, I mean, obviously the
Right.
interim superintendent thinks this is something that they,
I think it was his proposal, right?
yeah.
it was his proposal, but
Is
It's
it, or
only
is
on
he
the
doing
list
it to
of-
cut costs, or is he doing it because he thinks that the?
no, it adds
It
costs.
increases.
Costs.
There are certain things that have, that,
Right, if they're not gonna be teaching,
it means we have to hire teachers to fill in that role of that class that they weren't teaching.
I mean, is there something behind this that we don't know about?
I can't say, all right, and I've listened to the conversations, I can say that Westport operates a little bit differently than Darien. I mean, you've all heard that I am vehemently against having the school psychologists out at the elementary schools. For number one, it's inconsistent because the school psychologists in Middlesex and the high school are doing the same thing and nobody's being allocated on those two. I also think that we've always put our special ed in one location, and then it's better to, and I just think it's more impactful to say there's a whole team of people that work with mainstream, the 504s, as well as crisis that may occur when, you know, just because if a kid comes in and he's in crisis, regardless of 504 or a special ed, just a mainstream child in crisis, don't think that the school psychologist, the special ed, the social workers, or anybody else who's there isn't there supporting that child in that time of need. And there's those things that occur which are part of the special ed course. but I've estimated that 5 to 10% of special ed has always been used for mainstream education.
Jack, just on that point, about housing people in special, I think is your, does that also impact what we were talking about earlier about the excess cost reimbursement? Is there a financial impact to the town?
No, because they're supposed to be assigned, but, you know, I also, I don't like this being recorded. I did have some concerns that they're supposed to be working a 36-hour, 6-day work week, and they already listed 42, and my guess is they're probably working 48, which not only has us out of compliance with the contract, but also says, which is what Deb was asking during the meeting, you know, if you split it up and they're really working 48 and they're supposed to be working 36, they're already over that. And so to say that 100% of this person is really on mainstream is just inaccurate, because probably from what it was, it's at most 2/3, at most. So there's a whole slew on that, but you know, we can express our opinions on these, but at the end of the day, the board will make its decision. I think there's some support
It's on the
for
list.
this.
Who was it that proposed it, do you remember?
I think Dennis. I think Dennis might have proposed it. But I think there's some support on it, for it, and just you can find out what people are thinking, you know.
Well, I mean, to my way of thinking, it is policy, but if you disagree with it, I mean, and you don't have line item authority, I mean, are you gonna say, you know, we disagree with it, we're going to take 65,000 out of the budget? I mean, unless you're ready to do that.
Yeah, I'm not
You
ready
know,
to
I mean,
say,
it's their,
You got nothing.
it's
you
their
know.
policy, you can do it, but just, you know, in just thinking ahead in policy, you know, you can wait another year before you do it and let the next guy make that decision, as opposed to somebody who's one and done. That's all I'm saying is
Yeah,
that.
no, I know what
there
you're
was-
saying, but.
Because Brenner had a thought process, and this had worked for
Right.
him very well, not in one institution, but in two.
Mhm.
So, you know, the thing I was mentioning, Westport used to have an assistant principal who was solely responsible for special ed in their elementary schools. And it's only because I did a special ed analysis within the DERG that I found that out, but they were kept in the elementary school, not in special ed. So when we were looking at special ed numbers, Westport looked lower, because he had spread his special ed throughout the school system. So it's just how you handle things are differently. You know, I'm not saying, Jerry Ann, this is how we've handled it, I didn't see a reason for change. So that's all I'm saying, but I'll let other people talk on the school budget. Anything else?
Not for me, that was it.
I'd be real happy if they got down lower than, under 2.7, closer to 2.6, and it's totally possible.
For those of you that,
Jack,
Well, we've discussed before, and the way to do that would be to essentially ask them to reduce their flexibility. I mean, we talked about that's the mechanism for that. On the other hand, we've also talked about how we don't wanna do that because that's, gives them the ability to manage their program better and have that budgetary flexibility. So I think we've kind of discussed both sides of the coin.
But if
I'm-
you could give back 700,000 last year,
Right.
that says you have, and by the way,
Lots of
spend
Right.
about over $1 million. That said that there was a lot of flexibility in there.
I think,
And so if I'm even suggesting from where they are now, because remember, this is up.
Right.
So we're talking about, not that we're cutting anything, we're talking about reducing the up. I hate when we say we're cutting a budget. No, the budget isn't cut. We're reducing the up. And we're talking about to get them from 2.82 down to 2.6 is $200,000. that would still give them spending $1 million, and they could still return 500,000 to the town. So I think that's sufficient flexibility.
What's the average amount that the board has returned to the town for the last 5 years?
There's some years that we've only gotten back about 100 to 200.
I mean, it's,
But that doesn't mean they haven't
Spent,
spent quite a bit coming back from excess cost.
right, or it doesn't, but there was one year where, between the time of the budget and the end of the school year, certain commitments were made for out-of-district placement that the board was unaware of. And so fortunately, the combination of the healthcare with the prescription saved significant funds, and we were a little bit favorable, but that budget year, as of December, they were $1 million in the hole. So, you know, in that year, there was other things that occurred, so it wasn't just that they were spending on new technology, this, that, or other, or buying school books for next year. They were in the hole, and they still ended up returning money that year.
So Jack, you said that the initial proposal from the administration was a 70% reimbursement rate?
Yep.
So if you add back 100, 200, what reimbursement rate do we come out at?
Yeah, well, first of all, they've been receiving about 72 or more % anyway.
No, I know, I'm just
So,
wondering.
no,
when you
I'm
make it-
just telling you what they're giving back. So, since my calculation backing into what the submission was $5 million, the 2% on that is just nothing more than raising it. One way to look at it is, they raised it from 70% reimbursement to what it's historically been, above 72%. That's the 100,000 right there. And they
Okay.
still have the same flexibility that they had from before, because if they do 5 million and the pool stays the same and we get 72%, they're still gonna end up with about $700,000 to $800,000 more than what they have in budget. All they're doing, that 100,000 they're giving back is nothing more than just raising the rate back to what they received this year. That's why I said, give a little bit back out of the flexibility of what you really had budgeted and what you got. Because if they had a 72% rate on excess cost, the reimbursement rate would have been 2.85 million.
what I'm hearing from you is, and I think collectively, is that there's money being returned at the end of each fiscal year. That's money that we're taxing, that maybe we shouldn't be taxing. Can we come up with is there a mechanism in terms of their budget preparation so that they're not doing that? Or maybe they're returning a de minimis amount.
A smaller amount, right. And still having flexibility. I mean, the reality is they had $1.7 million of
I mean,
flexibility.
have we had that informal discussion with them about, on this topic?
We kind of addressed it last year, right? Like,
Yeah,
So,
Well,
so
I
we would
mean-
really just have to say, look, guys, if we think 2/8's high, we think you should come in at 6, 7, whatever.
well, actually it goes the other way.
Oh, I was thinking,
percentages. she
Oh,
said.
percentages, oh, sorry.
really, you wanna go up?
No, I'm thinking you're talking about excess cost.
No,
but that
I'm
was
going,
what they
I'm
just
going
happened
back to top
coincide.
level looking
Okay.
at it,
Yeah.
because that's, in essence, that's what we're saying.
Yeah,
If there's money in there that comes back, then you can not ask for as much. So is that what we would do, as far as we'd say, well, we as a group won't approve your budget, or we will go against you, this is just talking, unless it's at 2.6 or 2.65 or 2.7 or whatever number, is that what we would say? And should we say that and go back to them and say,
well,
we feel like you still have room to cut, basically, and then we're not talking about whether they cut the salaries of teachers or don't, or raise teachers or whatever, they still have that flexibility within their budget to do all that. So that's really, our call more is to say that we think overall, they can lower it. Is that seems to be what you're
I'll let
saying?
I mean, it's a pretty generic number we're looking for, and they can find it in a variety of ways. I mean, I can identify several different pockets where they could cut it, they could do it generically, they could just say, you know what, bring everything down by 20 basis points. But that's not our call, I don't think we have to get that much in the weeds.
Well, that's what I'm saying,
Well, all
I
we
think,
have
is
to
that,
say
it
is
sounds like we're all
2.6
saying that we think they
is
still can come
reasonable.
down.
You
Right.
know,
Somewhere.
I don't know
Somehow.
how aggressive we wanna be
There's
about
also, there's
stating
also
what
an
our
unintended
goal
consequence.
increase number
Yeah.
is. I don't think he's up for that.
There's also a potential unintended consequence here, which is you're giving them incentive to want to go out and spend as much as they possibly can, so they're
Right.
not giving back any money.
Right, well, we're tracking
No,
it very
but we're
closely,
tracking,
too.
we are tracking what they're getting and what they're spending, so we know that differential. And in fact, interesting enough, when Kate was going through, not to get into the other, but when Kate was starting to talk about her budgeting process, the exercise that Taylor's been doing, Kate has started to do on the Board of Selectmen. So I think our point is that we've had conversations, Taylor's approach was there. I don't wanna give target numbers, they are under the 3 that was targeted by John, but I think if we think that there's still some opportunity there, I think our focus is now speaking with the Board of Finance. That,
What is the Board of Finance saying to the Board of Ed?
they haven't really had, other than they said, we didn't want you over 3.
Oh,
And then John said, and if you can get it lower than that, that would be nice.
I have to say, we're staring down the barrel of some pretty nasty proposals statewide that are gonna push tax burdens for residents up quite a lot.
That could, if it occurs, but this is an ongoing argument between Taylor and myself.
I'm not even talking about special ed.
No, I'm just saying, there's a lot of proposals that are out there in Hartford. One might make a super high school that's going to win every sport in the state if they combine Darien and New Canaan. That concept of
I'm really talking about
regionalization.
that one.
But the fact is that we have to deal with the laws that are here now, and should something come out of the legislation as we're getting close to budget, we will be able to address it prior to our May vote. And that's what we're gonna have to do. Or, as John has stated, if it's a significant amount, the loss of car tax, the personal property on cars, the incremental basis point on real estate. If we're losing revenue, it would be about 4.5 million on the cars for the town. If we lose excess costs, if we have to pay pensions, a supplemental tax bill will be issued so that citizens understand what transpired. And that's the only way we can deal with it. You can't undercut now and tax people for a maybe, because then we're overtaxing our citizens to begin with.
No, I would never suggest that. I think that though, in the face of all these things coming at us, we have to be, I would say all hands have to be on deck, Board of Finance, Board of Ed, our group, everybody, to run this lean this year. I
Don't
mean,
forget Board of Selectmen, because we haven't even gone there yet.
yeah, I have admittedly not been part of that as much, but there is room in this budget to cut it. I think everybody should be on board with running it as close to comfortable as we can, and I would say there's quite a bit of room, more than probably 200,000 in there,
But we'll see what happens, we've made our case. I think that the next case, if we do believe, and I know there's members on the Board of Finance that look at excess costs. And so they'll probably be looking at that again. So, that's, if we're not happy as a group with where they end up after their go-round, I think they have some viable things on the table. I'm willing to have the board decide what they believe is best on that, but if we're still not happy with the number, then we approach the Board of Finance and tell them that we're unhappy there. Because this is still the superintendent's budget until they vote on it. So I don't wanna be telling the Board of Ed what they should be doing. But we can say, this is where, when we look at the total picture, where's capital, I mean, there may be some, not on this list, but I think that there's some discussions going on capital on the request out of the Board of Ed. I don't know that Checkpoint Charlie is going to make it through the cut.
It makes no sense.
No, but before the Board of Ed votes on the superintendent's budget, it would be reasonable for us to give them a sense of how we're thinking.
We already did.
Okay.
We did that on.
That was our
the-
comments, and there's been discussion, there's.
Yeah, so, and they've heard it.
They watch the meetings too, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, they've heard us, so, I mean, you
So
know,
what are we discussing here then?
just where we see what cuts they have on the table, which ones we are hopeful that they take. And then.
And also,
Well, I mean,
it
are you
seems,
What is our
thinking you're gonna
target
make
budget?
any kind of a cut or recommend a cut? I mean,
Right.
or
Let
we
me
just?
see what the final budget comes out to,
okay.
all right?
All right.
We gotta remember that the grand list is down, which is going to
And
have,
people are gonna be paying a lot more in taxes, you know.
people may be
Local,
paying more in
federal.
taxes.
Oh, yeah.
The
Salt
the
tax
Fed
alone.
has already affected, many of the blue states, that, the Fed taxes. And, you know, let's see how revenues shape up, let's see how much capital is there, and let's see what the Board of Finance decides they're willing to bond. You know, based upon the other things, what they might be taking out of the general fund, or other things like that. So until the Board of Finance gets all those, until the two boards vote on theirs, and then it gets to the Board of Finance and they put together, and, you know, we talk about the VOPE report, until you see the VOPE report, that's the real crux when you see what the increase is.
I
You know?
don't think you wanna get all the way to the Volpe report with 2/3 of our overall budget. I mean, we've identified that the flexibility looks like it's 2%. I mean, what are we comfortable, what are we asking for? Are we asking maybe for 1.5?
Well, the VOPE report, when they first do it, that, they're working off of that. I mean, that's, the Board of Finance sees the two approved boards, they see the numbers, they see the capital, and then they're seeing what the end result
Yeah,
is.
that's getting to a mill rate though, but if you believe that a budget is too big, it doesn't matter, you know.
Well, but it's
Right.
all within the concepts. I mean, as I said, if they got it down into the 2.6s, I would be a lot happier than 2.7s.
I mean, you know, 200,000 out of
Isn't a
this
lot.
budget is 0.2%. I mean, if you think they can't find, you know, if there isn't 200,000 spread around there.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, it's really not a lot, and considering that they gave back 700,000, and just the mere fact of the change by doing 70% versus 72 is equal to the 100,000 they wanna do as a give back, they still, if everything remains the same, are gonna have the million that they spent, because they have budget ups and downs, and another 700,000 coming in. So
I think
that's,
$500,000's not unrealistic.
yeah, I don't think we're getting there,
Yep.
but 200,000, 200, 250, I think is doable.
And if unexpected costs rise halfway through the year, we usually approve them.
Yeah.
And don't ask for it.
So, anything else on the Board of Ed?
No.
Let's go to Board of Selectmen. Bert, you had some observations?
Okay, so I read the Day and Times today, and the headline says, Board of Selectmen budget going up by 3%. And that's not a number that I recall, because I think we're starting at 3.98%. So I wished we were at 3%. We also changed the way we operate on the Board of Selectmen budget to mirror what's being done on the Board of Education, where the conversation is between the members of the members of FNB and the Board of Education, and maybe the administration, but not the departments. So here too, until now, I believe, until last year, including last year, I would be talking to the department heads within the administration, and instead now we're talking to Kate Bush and the Board of Selectmen. I think initially I thought that actually does create efficiencies, that puts Kate Bush into the driver's seat. She's gonna have to negotiate with the department heads, and she comes up with a holistic number and an aggregate number that we can look at. The disadvantage is that we really are responsible to our constituents. We are the ones who have to recommend the budget to the RTM, so we have to show that we conducted as much due diligence as is required. I mean, I was, and David too, and Jack, we were here, you know, the last week most nights. And also, this all works well when the headline number works, but when you get into the nitty and gritty, there might be a time when you wished you had talked to the department heads. Now, when we have to go into the nitty and gritty is when we cannot solve the big issues. I think the positive is that everyone agrees that the 4% number is too high. I think Kate Bush agrees on that, the Board of Selectmen agree on that. I think what I heard from the Board of Finance, they're not happy with that number, and certainly we have our concerns in this day and age to have an increase of 4%. So we all agree on that. We all agree we need to get the numbers down. The easiest ways to get the numbers down is to look at the big stuff, okay? That's manpower. That's additional manpower. In this instance, they're looking for 3 more dispatchers, and these civilian dispatchers add a considerable amount of money to the budget. However, and we have turned that down in the last few years. However, it is very difficult to turn down this year because the manpower that is freed up by having uniformed dispatchers moving into the ranks of the active police officers allows to realize a proposal to, one, have a dedicated narcotics officer in an SRO at the middle school. And I don't think anybody can be against, it's difficult to be against those two proposals, you know. You're an SRO at the middle school in this day and age, it's not outrageous. And to have a dedicated narcotics officer is not outrageous. So they have linked these two issues and said, okay, you give us these 3 civilian dispatchers, and then that's gonna feed those 2 new positions. There's another position in Parks and Recreation for additional manpower for Parks and Recreation, which they already have. They transferred 1 position into Parks and Recreation because obviously the workload after they have Highfield Farm is higher than before. We all knew that, okay? We had, you know, since we had this meeting with the people in District 1, the neighbors who did not like Highfield Farm, and they were very outspoken, the neighbors, and we explained to them the taxpayer, all of the taxpayers in Darien are picking up the bill, and here's another incident where, yes, all the taxpayers in Darien will have to pay for that extra person in Parks and Recreation because the workload is gonna be different than before. So it will be difficult to cut for these big items, in which case you're going into the nitty-gritty, which is tough, as we discussed with the Board of Ed right now, because our job is kind of set the guidelines and be the overall, feedback from the taxpayer, and not to be micromanaging things that the people in the various departments know better. As I said earlier, the department heads might actually, if we had a conversation, they might explain it better to us. Everyone had to go into the nitty and gritty and is still going into the nitty gritty. Actually, Kate Bush had in the last meeting cut out $280,000, okay, including a substantial amount for the employee benefits medical insurance, which I still think we need to look, Jack and I might want to look at some more. That's the first 300,000. There may be some more money because we need to find out how the interest is earned in the general account, if there's any potential to at least increase the revenue.
That's
Okay.
that's one of the conversations I had with Kate, and Bert's gonna have a follow-up with the town treasurer. And at times Kate's at a disadvantage because while she's the town administrator, the town treasurer is an elected official of the town. So, it's a slightly different situation, but, and besides the fact that Bert has wonderful expertise in this, when I was speaking to Kate earlier today, I said, I'm pretty simplistic about this. We've earned over $260,000 on our investments in the first 6 months of this year. And even though it's not a direct correlation, we're not getting paid Fed fund rates, the Fed's increased rates in September as well as in December, and therefore that's going to be reflected in what the banks are paying us for our investments, because every interest rate moves up accordingly on the yield curve. So if I just double that comes out to approximately $530,000. And I don't need to get into the minutia of investment yield curves and that. It's just, since we're not gonna have any major cash ciphering off, if I just double what we did in the first 6 months, and knowing that the Fed's supposedly going to increase rates at least twice before we even get to 2020, and you're only recording 300,000, something that seems to be a rather substantial opportunity there. Because you're only $30,000 off of what your budget after 6 months after what you budgeted for the whole year of 2020, and that just doesn't make sense when rates are going up. So I told her that's my simplistic view of it.
And we don't have to go in all the details because we need more time. And I think David and Michael have spent some time on that too. Other people have commented on it. Once you go into the very details, it gets tough. $20,000 here and $40,000 here. It's hard. But I think that is where things are moving. And I don't think at this point we have to be proactive, other than this item, because it's
I
300,000.
actually have another one that I want to be a lot more proactive on.
Okay, so at this point, I think we want to be proactive on the large items,
There's a couple of them.
okay? Or medium-sized items, but for us to get into the 10 and 20,000, let them do that work.
I'll take a
Okay.
couple of 20s, but anything under that, I don't care.
Okay.
Well, the park and rec position, now they added I forgot what it's called, a program supervisor about a year or two ago, right?
Right.
And now they did lose one person to Public Works and they wanna
Right.
replace it and they do have more land, but that is adding somebody that's, I think the total cost is about 80,000, 81,000. That's person, you know, where you're
Mhm.
gonna be paying benefits, so right along. And I know they looked at seasonal and temporary and for whatever reason, people, they didn't think that was right, but I'd like to have a better understanding. I mean, you know, I know they mow lawns, they plow snow. I mean, I think for 80,000, you could probably spend a lot less than that if you contracted out to some landscape service. I mean, I don't know, it may not be feasible, but I would like to know that it's really been carefully investigated.
I think that's one of the things that we wanna put back on the table. You know, the same way, one of the questions were that there's the state employee health fund, and several people asked why Greenwich joined, we haven't. Kate said she did an analysis, you know, it may be worthwhile, maybe not this budget cycle, but subsequently to look at the analysis going into the future year. But I do think there's some opportunities here. The next big nut that came out is that the town employees can accumulate sick days, and then when they retire, they get paid out at a much higher rate, and I think it's capped at something, but they could almost have like 20 or 30 days of sick days that they get paid out, which, you know, is about a quarter of a year when you retire, and it's accrued at one rate, and you're being paid out at the other. So one of the concepts was to put some money aside to offer to buy out people in the current year. Jamie put that on the table last night, saying, you know, that's $150,000. The question is, do we wanna, you know, no different than we do for future medical benefits for retirees. My thought process was, do we want to set up a fund for that and accrue with it based upon actuarial? Or you just set up a program where you offer it, and if it comes out, you know, that's part of the reason why you have contingency at the Board of Finance. There were a couple of other things. The motorcycle came off. Again, it's a $5,000 item, but that came off. And there's a couple other things that they put on the table to discuss.
Right, but also two things we should keep in mind that are more, that's not a numbers item. I mean, we always talk about the numbers, but I think in the Board of Education budget, what sticks out is that they spend, it's the expense for for absentee situations where they have to bring in people that may make overtime or whatever. And on the town budget, they do have a substantial amount of overtime.
Particularly in the police patrol.
And
Yeah.
especially in the police department, which they do, I guess, before they retire, they're happy to increase more, you know, do some more overtime, and then maybe even take the civilian dispatcher position. So, and the overtime is going up in the plan, in the budget, despite the fact that we will be allowing for the civilian dispatchers, which moves manpower into the pool, which could then feed into the amount of overtime. Now, the overtime is also governed by the training that they have to do. So, and that's always done in overtime. But in the contract that we saw today, it says that you don't have to pay them overtime. You can give them
On the weekend.
compensatory time off. Okay, so if some, you know, we free up some manpower,
Well, you know,
and that slack can be taken up by, you know, making rearrangement. These are management decisions.
another point, I noticed the dispatchers are not time and a half on the weekends, and now presumably we've had the police there who which
Yeah.
has been time and a half, so
Okay.
there's savings there.
That's a good point. One of the things that we, first, just so that everybody's on the same page. 50% of the patrol overtime is training. And so when I was talking about whether or not I had sent something off to Kate and the captain gave a response, we are a tier 2 police force, we are considered very good, and we want a police force to have all the appropriate training, domestic violence, violence and all that. I mean, you really do want them to have that. And we have not been cited on the, discrimination and other things like that. And we've had a couple of instances, but we haven't been.
That's a given, you know. you
Right,
have to provide
right. So that's all things that are important to have a viable police force. That being said, when I was trying to go back and calculate, since overtime was about 15-16%, and assuming that it's time and a half, then I said, okay, so that brings 7.5 down to 5%. So it's almost as if the police are signing up for whatever their work hours are. Typically, it's $2,050 for an employee. But it's almost that in order to maintain their accreditation and all their services, there's another 5% that you're going to be working over that. So there's like another 100 hours that you're working on it. And one of the things Kate brought back to me is that during these trainings, and this is where management may come in, that when somebody's coming in for training, it's a guaranteed 2 hours, it's a guaranteed 4 hours. So, you don't want to do an hour training where everybody's being paid 2 hours, and 2 hours at time and a half.
Yeah.
So that's something to look at. The other thing is that there is a commitment from the police chief to bring in narcotics. I think something was misstated at the Board of Selectmen meeting, or misunderstood. Chief mentioned that there's a lot of shared intelligence that goes on between Newark and Stamford, especially in the drug units. And they're willing to share with Darien. The problem is, because we do not have a dedicated narcotics officer, we're not getting the same information, because we're getting it periodically as opposed to having somebody who's working as part of that overall team. And so that would be very helpful, especially with the opioid epidemic that's going on in the youth that are using it. And this is not about, pot's going to be made legal down the road. Anyway, this is the harder drugs that we're talking about, of which they're focused on. So I think that was misunderstood. We need this narcotics officer to really integrate with Norwalk's and Stanford and get that intelligence.
Can I go back to the overtime? And
Sure.
I said this about the substitute teachers, and I say this about the police patrol, and I recognize that half of the overtime is, devoted to
Yeah.
training. But each year, the budget just automatically increases. And I don't think that sends the appropriate message that you're really serious about asking them to manage overtime, and in the case of teachers, absenteeism. It's the same thing. I think there were 3 elementary schools, very significant increases, and yet they're increasing it again. And what does that tell everybody?
Well,
That
I
absenteeism can continue. I just,
I agree with you, Martha. I asked the question that in the current budget, overtime is planned to be 15.3% of salaries. In next year's budget, it's 16.3%, and that 1% increase, I haven't heard why. I haven't heard incremental training, I haven't heard, and the
well,
fact
it
that.
shouldn't be anyway. I mean,
Well, I'm
didn't they
just
talk
saying.
about how they had people out last year, but the people are back?
Well, that's.
And now something unexpected may happen, but I don't
That
think
was
we
the other
should
thing
build
that
that
I
in.
was talking
I
about.
mean, we'll give them the money if they need it.
Right, that was the other thing that I was thinking about, that, they were down some officers because there were a lot of retirements and other things like that, so they had people working overtime for that. But we're back at full staff.
Right.
So if we're back at full staff and we're intending to be back at full staff, I don't, we should see a lower correlation of overtime and that. And so, you know, one of the things that the Board of Finance asked for of the Board of Ed when it came to the electrical panel was analytics. And they're just, on the police, on the overtime and a couple of other things, civilian dispatch, there just isn't the analytics there. I'm not saying that I'm against it, I'm just saying it should be supported by analytics. And it's my understanding that last year when, in the buddy system, when Jamie, Rob Cordone, and Stacy met with the police, that they talked about what analytics they would like to see in order to move the civilian dispatch forward. And I think both Rob and Stacy even offered to go and help, because these are police officers, I'm not expecting them to be accountants, would help them put it together. And I mentioned that to Kate and asked Kate to circle back with Jamie, Rob, and Stacy and get some of the analytics that they talked about. So if we're not getting it here, I imagine that this is one of the departments that the Board of Finance is going to have a continued work on the buddy system. Because this overtime has to be addressed or
Not
rationalized.
Not for nothing, Kate added $54,000 to the overtime number that the police department requested.
She did, in addition.
The adopted budget number was 533.2, and the town administrator proposed budget is 587.6. So the town administrator added to the,
Oh, you're
Propo-
saying from what, last year's?
no, from the proposed budget, the 18-19 adopted budget column
Was
was
533.
533.
And now.
Last year's actual was 545, so the budget number that was put forth by the police department was 533, at least that's my understanding of that column.
Yeah,
That was
That
last
column,
that was
And
last year.
That was last year.
No, that last year.
year. It's 1920 now.
She's added, that's the 1% increase that
So-
I haven't.
oh, that's the adopted budget for, yeah,
See,
sorry, okay,
587.
sorry.
So that's-
It's gone
so-
from 533 to 587, which
but
is a 10.2% increase.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's still.
But that's the 1% as in relationship to salary that we're still looking for some answers on.
Do you know, did Rob and Stacy get like any metrics? I mean, if half of the $533,000 number was training, right?
That's what they say.
What
yeah.
is the $275,000? How do you get, are there so many emergencies in this town that we're calling in the 49 sworn officers for 22,000 citizens?
No,
Enough to
I
generate
think,
$500,000 worth of overtime?
I will tell you, here's part of the problems with the absenteeism. And when I make a comparison to the Board of Ed. If you have a classroom, you need to have a teacher in there. Just because somebody's out, you can't say, okay, I'm gonna cut back on substitutes, so I'm not gonna put a teacher in that classroom. Somebody has to be there. The same way, and we're never gonna have full discussion of what the number of patrol officers are, because that's sort of like telling the Germans what your D-Day plans are. But they have desired patrol on the road, doing other work and other things like that during the day, evening, and night shifts. So if somebody calls out sick, that's where the absenteeism. I may not have to worry unless it's a snowstorm if somebody in Park and Rec calls out sick. I'm not backfilling that. I may not have to backfill if Public Works somebody calls out sick again, unless it's a snowstorm and I gotta figure out how I'm gonna get something plowed. When the police are out, that's the place we're gonna have to backfill. And I think that we're gonna find that absenteeism, you know, either due to sick or other things like that, injury or other things, or what's adding. But we've requested analytics. We wanna see what the prior years were so we can start to map it. One of the things that Kate did say, except OpenGov isn't there yet, And, you know, in the first year, I wouldn't have expected it to be. But Kate believes there's a direct correlation between the number of positions filled and what the overtime is, absences and what the overtime is. And I think that those are some of the analytics that we really need to have being managed, or at least more closely viewed. And that's how we're gonna get down to it. But, yeah, I just didn't see a lot of analytics on this. I would have liked to have seen more on the civilian dispatch.
I'd just be curious, how many absences are there a year?
Yes, I think that's,
51 patrol officers.
yeah.
I mean, it might be illuminating. It
Well,
might,
we
it
know
might
f-
be very few, or I
And
don't
how
know.
many are on disability or other
Right.
things like
But
that?
Martha, we know from the Board of Education meeting that they admitted that Darien, even the superintendent says, we have nothing like this in Westport.
Right.
Darien
They have a
sticks
problem,
out.
they admitted.
Well, Darien
Was-
is high in the education, but we're
No,
talking about,
was teachers absent.
right,
Yeah.
but we're talking
Yeah.
about the police right now.
Yeah, y'all keep going back and forth between education and.
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
stay on the
Let's
police.
stay on one track, I'm
No,
like, it
what I'm
is-
saying, sorry, what I'm saying is, they did the analysis where they had a comparative study of what's happening in Westport, or told us, same here. For the police, we should see, so what is the overtime situation in Norwalk and New Canaan?
Well, I mean, I
Right.
guess, but
Yeah, I'd
Yeah.
just like to see what analytics they're doing now and then what programs they're doing. I think the analytics are there, they have to run some reports. We asked the chief to run the prior 2 years to at least give us some information so we can start to have a better understanding.
I mean, they have that computer system, Telstat.
That's
that
the
is
one they're
supposed
going
to
through.
help them with their planning. I mean, it should be easily pulled off of that.
Well, and that's
I would
one of the
think, but
things,
I don't know.
that's one of the things, we're going to have a meeting with Bert, myself. I may ask Stacy to join us because she's done this in the past. Jamie, Kate, and the chief and Captain Anderson, because the way they run, and I think it was in the document, it's like 3 days on, 2 days off, 4 days on, with this off, and other things like that.
Excuse me.
So, we also have a minimum number of patrol officers that have to be on duty in the evening and night shifts. So that officer who was doing dispatch was part of that minimum. That means that the minimum isn't going away. So if we're moving to, I'm just gonna deal with the SRO because the narcotics could be both day and night. But the SRO during the school year is a day job. That means that there's one less officer to put into that rotation to cover those evening shifts.
Yep.
And I just wanna see how they're thinking they're doing it. And Chief even said it's not a one-to-one, just because I'm taking an officer off of the dispatch doesn't mean I have 2 people available for day.
Not the way they do the schedule.
Right, so that's one of the things that we're talking about, because I just mathematically had difficulty, and Bert, you first raised it, I just couldn't see the mathematics working on this. And, you know, I'm not a scheduler of that, and maybe there's a way that they're doing it, but I just want people to be able to come back and say this is it. I do wanna go to one, oh, go ahead.
If you don't mind having an extra body, can I sit in?
I have to see how many they want, all right?
Oh, David can go instead of me, I'm fine.
Okay, all right,
Well,
Since
I-
I'm meeting,
I don't
since
wanna
I'm
cut- I don't wanna
meeting
cut you
with
out, David.
Joan,
okay.
Why doesn't
Let me,
he
let
say?
me check with
Okay.
Kate, just,
Alright.
so I don't mind, I'm gonna try and get it, but I think that's fine,
Whatever, I don't
because
wanna cause too much.
I
trouble.
just don't want 5 people there, that's all from us.
So, I have a question about, so they want 3 bodies to be dispatch.
Right, they need 2 on and they need 1 to cover,
So right now, they have
3.
officers, police officers are covering.
Right now, they have 1 police officer who's doing dispatch.
And two civilian dispatchers, right?
No, they have 3 in the day shift. They have none in the evening shift. A police officer is doing the dispatch
At night,
in the evening, because there's also night.
okay.
So,
And who does the night one then?
an officer, but we're doing it one shift at a time.
So the 3 people that they wanna hire are to take the officer out for evening and nighttime?
It's to take the officer out of doing dispatch.
Right, that's what I'm talking about,
Yeah.
out of
The day
dispatch.
shift
Out of
and the
dispatch.
evening shift.
So there's an officer in the daytime also? Doing
No,
dispatch,
no, no,
just
no.
doing dispatch?
Okay, let's start from the beginning then, so we're not
Right, so
confused.
we're doing, we're
We
talking
have,
dispatch.
3 shifts.
Yes,
there's
I got
3
that,
shifts.
3 shifts.
The day shift already has civilian dispatch.
No officer dispatch, just,
No officer,
just
civilian,
civilian, okay.
all right? They're trying to move the evening to civilian, again, because it's time,
Sometimes
it's
I'm just
activity.
trying to understand who's where, and
And so currently on the evening shift, one officer a rotating officer, but one patrol FTE
yeah.
is doing dispatch.
And they have, and then are there civilian dispatched in the
No,
evening?
there's no civilian on either the evening or the night. We're
Okay.
introducing civilian to the evening, because that's the next most active.
Then why do we need 3?
You
More.
need 3 because you're always supposed to have two on dispatch. You're supposed to have 2 dispatches.
It's for days off and the fact that
And
they
then
work.
But we don't have that right now, is what they're saying.
Well,
We have
we
3.
don't have 2 dispatches, we don't have 2 officers doing dispatch, which is what we should have to begin with, all right? So you're gonna have 2 people who are there to do dispatch, which frees up the officer to do officer-type work in the evening.
So we're gonna replace 1 dispatch person in the evening with 2 people?
No, we're replacing a police FTE with 2 people, which is what the standard is for dispatch anyway. We're not meaning standard for dispatch is what I'm saying.
Okay, well, that's a whole different argument than that we're adding dispatch. If there's a is that, and whose standard is that? Is that our standard? Is that a national standard, a state standard,
I think it's just basically a messaging times and other things like that, how to achieve those times. I can't cite which of the standard it is, but you're not supposed to have a single person on dispatch.
Sounds like a best practice.
How
Yeah,
is-
that's it, that's
how
a
is
better
this-
way to put it, but I'll find out what the standard is.
But you sound like, I
No,
try
I
to
understand.
understand, why do we need that extra body when we haven't been using that extra body?
Because we
I
really
understand
should.
replacing of the officer and going to civilian, that might make sense, but I'd like to understand.
I'll get more information on that, but we really are supposed to.
And second
have
also,
two.
then the officer bodies that are now freed up, we're saying that 1 body would go to the middle school. Is that, so,
No,
It's
this
not
is-
a 1-for-1. The commitment is that if you give the police the evening dispatch, they will arrange the schedule to have one of the officers become the SRO at the middle school, which is a day job.
I mean, that's a real 1 officer, so that they have a relationship, so it's not like
Right, that isn't,
Joe's on Monday, Sam's on Tuesday.
right, that's a single person. And then they will also move an officer into the detective bureau, because that's where I believe it goes, for a narcotics officer. And they're gonna have to rearrange the patrol to accommodate that.
Well, won't that take away from our patrol? Because now we've got,
Not every
these are not
officer-
bodies that are-
Because they've been doing dispatch and, it's a whole rotation
Okay.
schedule and.
And not everybody's out on the
we,
road.
I didn't think we're gonna approve 5 positions, 2 new officers, 1 SRO, 1 being an SRO.
and has our crime rate gone up?
And so, they wanted
Yes.
to.
It has. By how
Yes, by everyone who doesn't
Off the
lock their
top.
damn doors.
Wasn't
read-
there-
I-
is-
I read-
I know, we read a lot in the paper.
You're onto a key point here, and one of the points is, when they got the first 3 dispatchers, they made the same argument that the officer or officers that were freed up would go back to regular patrol. And there are 0 metrics that have been provided in terms of how many increased calls have the patrol people responded to, how many increased violent crimes have they responded to, how many drug crimes, how many, you
So
know.
we don't have that
we have-
information.
we have-
Well,
No.
they did
we
provide
have no-
certain
we
information.
we
They
have,
did.
we
There's
have
some
no
in there.
data to indicate whether or not those patrol officers returning to patrol have yielded any increase in public safety in the town, no.
But they have it, they gave us some, which is the number of burglaries, robberies, how many were solved, and other things like that. They didn't give us some of the traffic things, because if you're putting somebody out onto the road, how many incremental stops of unregistered vehicles did you make? How many warnings did you give? And that was something that was asked by the Board of Selectmen to provide those information. So that, it's again, very similar to what the Board of Ed did when they went for the.
They gave us they gave us the burglary and other.
Yes,
Yeah, they
right
did.
here.
It's
Yeah,
it's
that's right.
absolutely-
I've
So
heard-
they gave us some statistics. In the end, it is an art and not a science, I think. You gotta trust them when they say this is what we need. They would have, if they would have felt we give them 5, they would have wanted to hire 5 people, 3 civilian dispatchers, 1 SRO and 1 narcotics.
Yeah, let's also realize in 30 years, we've added 1 police officer to our staff. And that was in the 1990s.
Burglary went
Yes.
down,
Aren't it,
robbery.
isn't
That-
that the
that
chatter
because
about
they have more
centralizing or
police,
consolidating
it just
dispatch
happens.
centers in
Burglary
Columbia?
went
Yeah,
down,
not
robbery
an
went
issue.
down, motor
It's
vehicles
really
went
not.
down.
I'm just saying, if we hired 3 new people and then that happened, what happened?
like
Can we?
to see-
I guarantee from doing
Traffic
outsourcing,
stops.
those 3 people are gonna be absorbed into that dispatch place faster than you can snap your finger. Their
So it
their
won't be like
benefits
any
will be
residual
different,
cost to
it's,
us.
nope, they're gonna go out there. The only issue is where it's located. So there are statistics here, and we've asked for it, and I think it needs a deeper dive. I did wanna go off of police.
I just wanna understand,
Crime in our town
No.
other than busting
if our
cars that
crime
people
wave is
break.
up, that we need
Right.
additional people that,
It's-
and
So
if you
traffic
put
stops
someone
is a
on
big number.
narcotics
I- I-
specifically,
That is the number
um,
that's interesting.
are they gonna have to have
Yeah.
additional training because they may not have done as much narcotics work as they might,
I'm-
gonna
I'm-
be doing when they're a
I'm
narcotics
assuming,
specialist?
that once they end up with whoever gets there,
Police officer and a-
because all the officers have certain training, but to be a full-fledged, I would imagine, like anything else, when you're going from one position to another, that there is going to be an initial startup training, no different than there is for an SRO. We have liaisons there, but they'll work with our current SRO that's at the high school. The same way that we've done some training with New Canaan when we first started the
It'd be
SRO.
one thing if there was a lot
We
of
sent
them.
our person to walk around with the New Canaan SRO to start training. So yes, there'll be some startup courses on training, but the fact is, you know, sometimes looking at crime waves are a little bit meaningless because the economic times matters to it, what's going on, and you know, I don't know, because the police are out, how many things they stopped. I do know that if you read, they've been able to capture more than 1 person on mail fraud, on
No,
going in
I
mailboxes.
think they've done a good job.
And
I'm not
so,
saying-
I don't know that it's a crime wave, as opposed to, how do I ensure that I'm providing the best safety for my citizens and those that are working here and travel here? And so,
We can't really know that by statistics, because
Yeah.
we're not experts in that field, but I think to the point, we understand the head count that's required. And if we're meeting something that wasn't there, that's important.
Mhm.
And I think at the end of the day, we've got to just ask them to provide some of the details of the data. And
That's it.
that's all we can really ask for right now.
right, all right.
That's what I saw.
Yeah, no, and it's been asked for, and I think if we don't get it here, we're gonna see it during the Board of Finance. There is one other thing that did raise its head, and I'm glad it did. There is a discrepancy between how one of the big things to our budget is capital requests for the Board of Selectmen is at $4 million this year. And while the Board of Ed looks like it's up from last year, it's because, remember, we bonded $1.5 million of Board of Ed requests. Their capital request is actually down this year. One of the practices that have been going on that has always bothered me, and hopefully we can start to address it, the Board of Selectmen put in annual amounts to get to some project that they want to do. So when they're putting in, they want to do a gas line into Darien Firehouse, there's like $60,000 that they plan to do over 5 years or 4 years to come up to what the budgeted amount is, as if it's an accrual. Where when the schools wanted to put a gas line into Middlesex or into the high school, this is the project, this is the cost of the boiler, I'm putting it in this year, you either bond it or you don't, and if it's too much of total capital in the year, then certain projects can be cut by the Board of Finance, or by us for that matter. I think that when I look through some of these things, there's just too many of those accruals. Now, on the other, there was $300,000 one year and $300,000 another year for a project that they want, which is $600,000 project. I'd rather you move it into this year. They're going to recommend that that be bonded by the Board of Finance. Board of Finance feels it's too much and they don't want to bond it, it gets cut. We'll do it next year. That, I'd like some consistency on that, on the projects, and I think that's a big savings out of our tax dollars. I know.
When you talk about accrual, you talk about they're putting money aside for something in the future?
Yep.
Yeah.
They're paying, so in an example that Jack gave, they used $300,000 worth of operating budget money to put into, effectively to put into an accrual for a capital expenditure.
No, it's a capital request. It is capital, but they're
But there's-
accruing capital over a number of
Yeah.
years.
It's still
And-
not.
How do they store that capital?
They put it, because every year, if it's part of the capital request, when we do our capital budget move, we move it all into the capital account, and so there's a project that will be done in the future that's getting $60,000 over, let's say, 4 years, until they're ready to do it, and then boom, they draw on that money.
But does the 60 come out of taxes each year?
Yep,
Yeah,
So
so,
it should be financed.
It's reverse bonding.
it can't be financed.
Is there such a thing?
Well, when the project's done, it should be financed.
It can't be, if we're accruing for it, you can't
we're paying
finance
for
it.
yeah.
That's the other,
Right.
that's the other downside.
Right.
The other thing that doesn't make sense is that when we're moving it into capital accounts, all these little mini accruals that become significant over time, we're moving it into allocated funds as opposed to unallocated funds. And the credit agencies, not that we have to worry because we're really in very good shape, but they prefer to see more unallocated than these little allocations. So one of the things we were discussing is, one of the projects, move it forward and make it the $600,000 project. If it needs to be bonded, we can, the Board of Finance will make that determination. But these other things, I'm not interested in, I wouldn't be interested in the Board of Education back of an envelope estimate. I'm sure the Board of Ed would love to do accruals on a lot of their capital projects, smaller capital projects.
But how is that different from what you were proposing for the baseball field?
Yeah. I
The
was gonna
difference,
say
the difference is that these are small projects and not large ones. So the real preference on the baseball field was, it was large enough that it should have been bonded, so that, over a 10-year life, so that people are paying for it as they're using it, all right? On these, we're paying for small projects. There's a lot of $10,000 and $20,000 projects that are never gonna be bonded, that are adding up to the tax base when it should be done in the year that it's done. No different than if I look at the Board of Ed, they have a lot of $30,000-$40,000 projects. I'm gonna put in carpet. Can you imagine the Board of Ed says, hey, I got a carpet, I wanna put in $5,000 a year and just keep it for me?
So you're saying there's not a cutoff number, like if we know the project's gonna be
I think
150, 200, whatever your number is?
I think about 500,000, I can understand that you wanna start to reserve for it over the life of it so that you're not doing massive spikes. I mean.
And so
we-
anything under 500 shouldn't
Yeah,
be
well,
that way?
we do it for
Okay.
all the vehicles on the public works. We put accruals in for the police vehicles.
Fire
We put in the fire, which is rather substantial.
Fire, the police we pay for every year.
Yeah, police we do, but the public works garage for the trucks and everything, because they're expensive equipment, we do annual accruals into that. I can buy that for fire trucks, I can buy that for the big dumb, trucks that are going there, large expenses. For some of these smaller ones, I'm gonna put in a new boiler and a gas line. When you're ready to do it, come with the project and come with good numbers, and it'll get passed. And if you're worrying about smoothing things out, I have my own philosophy, but if you I'm gonna come up with an estimate, but just say all the buildings that we own in town are worth $500 million, $500 million. Well, it's not unreasonable that we're putting in 1% in maintenance and capital improvements of $5 or $10 million a year, which is what major building owners do. A friend of mine works for Tishman. So that's what they do when they're planning on it. So you'd have an equal amount of what you're reinvesting in your buildings in total, and you're just picking out which ones you're doing. But to do these accruals are just inconsistent.
I would argue you want something in a particular year, you just pay for it unless it's a massive capital project.
Right, like a fire engine.
I think,
Yeah, and that's,
because you can't predict from year to year what's gonna happen, all this smoothing by bonding. There are always unexpected things that come along, and then you get yourself, you're hamstrung, you're gonna tie people up in the future.
and so that's one of the big things that I'd like to have a further conversation with Kate and Jamie and with John and the
John feel the same way?
What?
Does John Skrosky feel the same way?
I haven't raised it to him. For those wondering, I just said hello to John Bolton, who just got done with their meeting. I thought I'd answer the television audience. But, so, I mean, that's something that.
No, I hear you, I was just
I
trying
think
to
is
understand the difference, and it's the value of the project itself, that's
Right,
whether you build up to it. Okay, gotcha.
yeah, I mean, I understand that, I mean, so, from there, so, anything else on the Board of Selectmen? No?
Motion to adjourn.
I think we all agree that it's too high right now. We need to have it come down a little bit. Okay, we have 2 minutes. Oh, glad you brought copies, I did too.
1 minute.
Minutes.
We only have one?
Yeah, just from the last meeting on the
23rd?
23rd, yeah.
Okay. Were there any changes that anybody saw? Okay,
If you weren't at that meeting, you don't
You-
vote.
you can't vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so I need somebody who was at that meeting to move. You were at it, can you move the minutes?
Second.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
All who were there and in favor, raise your hand. Everybody else is abstaining, thank you.
First one I can vote on.
There you
Yeah,
go.
there you are. If there's nothing
Now you're
else
on
to
the hook,
be
man.
done, I'm for ending this meeting.
For the rest of the evening.
Can I ask
Get a motion to second.
a question about your thought?
Say bird.
So if you,
Motion to Miller.